Let me introduce Martin Webb. Martin has been in the renewable energy field for 25 years as a business owner and solar expert, which translated into a life of environmental activism for him. Whether producing radio shows on KVMR as the host of the Climate Report or on TV as the host of Tipping Point. It's a new monthly program on the Nevada County media, if you want to tune that in. And he has become a well-known voice for environmental awareness around a host of issues, including the proposed mine. So Martin, welcome again. We've had you on before, and we're certainly excited to have you back on this presentation series. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Excellent. So I'm going to look at the 3 case studies, which is what the RDN report felt were the strongest indicators for their conclusion that nothing would happen to our property values, and point out how we believe when you look a little bit closer, as the other speakers have done, the case studies don't really speak too well towards our situation with property values, but they do really show what the dangers are of having a mine near a community. So these might not be case studies for good results, might be for bad results. Next slide. But first, let's talk about the fact that while property values were directly mentioned in the scope of the report, as RDN talked about in last week's webinar and other speakers here have alluded to, there were a lot of important missing things in the stated scope of this report. There was no effort or ask for them to analyze Rise Gold's track record and their financial solvency. There was no economic assumption accuracy. They didn't vet the data that was provided with them. They just assumed all of it was perfectly real. They didn't give us an analysis of risks of failure and the likelihoods of outcomes. As the other speakers have alluded to, we should expect a cost to our community of the negative impacts. And for those who aren't aware, our tourism economy, just the tourism part in our county, is almost $400 million a year and almost 4,000 jobs created. And that wasn't in the scope to analyze, again, all of these negative aspects. But fortunately, the county did very specifically say, hey, please look at the impact on property value because that is so important to us. Next slide. And so they did dig quite deep into an analysis. To their credit, they did 3 different things. As Charlie said, they did a literature review, as well as a case study and a survey of real estate professionals. And in the literature review, they found 13 key studies that talked about mining and other industrial activities and how they impact property values nearby. Out of those 13, 11 were negative impacts. One said there was no impact to having a rock quarry near a residence. And then one showed that if you're in the Netherlands and you live within a mile of any industrial project, you would see a 4% bump in property value. Otherwise, overwhelmingly negative impacts, up to 17% loss in value. Next slide. And so what did they do with this information? They dismissed it all as irrelevant. Instead, they framed the literature review as saying, well, there could be a range of outcomes of plus 14 or minus 17, smoothing over the fact that all of them, except for that plus 4, were showing some sort of negative impact or neutral. And what's most important, and I think that it's a really important takeaway from this economic report, is they struggled to find comparable literature, comparable case studies. They couldn't find anything that closely resembled the proposed project during the literature review. And so that really underscores this is an unprecedented project. Next slide. So before I talk about the case study, though, I want to show you a little bit more of the data of the survey of real estate professionals. 75 realtors replied. They were overwhelmingly based in Grass Valley, so they know the area. They weren't rookies. The majority of them had been spending more than a decade as a licensed professional here in Nevada County. And you can see that overwhelmingly they were somewhat familiar with the draft environmental report. They believed the impacts would be worse than the reports, and they even referred to the San Juan Ridge mine incident where a project was allowed to proceed, and there were serious negative impacts to the community that were never predicted or contemplated in the DEIR for that project. So they had real data and experience to come from. So they overwhelmingly believed home values would go down 15% or more, and most concerningly, they said that these impacts would be permanent. Next slide. So what did they do with this overwhelming negative information? They dismissed it as irrelevant, saying, including in the webinar last week and in the report, that it's merely uninformed opinion, not based on any data. Quoting from the report's page 43, they dismissed the real estate professionals by saying that the survey is largely influenced by perceptions of the proposed project impacts. Well, you just listened to the former president of the Board of Realtors, Charlie Brock, say that that's what drives property valuation, is the perception. But what's interesting is before they dragged the real estate professionals through the process of a survey to dismiss it, they started off that section by saying something that I think we can all agree with. RDN assumes that our local real estate industry professionals have a better than average understanding of the major factors that determine home prices in the area. However, the report dismisses their opinion out of hand. Next slide. The literature review showed a lot of negativity. The survey of real estate professionals assumed a lot of negativity as far as property value impacts. Those were dismissed. So then let's focus on their case studies. And it's noteworthy because, again, to their credit, RDN did a lot of work here. They looked at databases for the Mine Safety and Health Administration, the U.S. Geological Survey. They were able to tap into up to 300,000 different mining locations. And they were laser focused in the report on trying to make sure that they really found comparable mines to this proposed project. Is it a mine that had been open and is closed and open again? Is it a similar type of material and process? How close are homes to the site? And is this surface mining or underground? Well, they found only 12 mines came close to this proposed project. So in order to whittle those down further, at those 12 mines, they looked at the population and housing density within 3 concentric circles, 1 mile away, 5 mile away, 10 mile away. And in that regard, they found only 3 that they felt like were practical and relevant that were included as the case studies. Next slide. So let's talk about these 3. The first one is the Hale Mine. It was a surface gold mine located in South Carolina. Next slide. That's what a surface gold mine looks like from above. It's quite a different visual impact than underground. Here we have concentric circles with the mine's main operations right in the middle. Those 3 red lines represent a half mile, 1 mile, and 2 miles away. What you'll notice, of course, in this one of the 3 best case studies for our property values, there really isn't much around that mine as far as residences. Next slide. Then you can see with this, the next picture that's going to come up here, what it looks like. I believe that the next one might be a comparison to Grass Valley. There we go. So here's a half mile, 1 mile, and 2 mile, the same exact picture for the Idaho, Maryland, Brunswick mine shaft right there at the corner of Brunswick and Bennett. You can see that this encompasses large swaths of Brunswick, plenty of Grass Valley citizens, Peardale, Union Hill, Banner Mountain, Cedar Ridge. Maybe click back one so that people can see the difference between how loaded our 2 mile and 1 mile and half mile radius is versus this first case study. And you can see that there really isn't a lot comparable in close proximity to the mine. Go ahead and click forward to the next one. Yep, so you can see that's the similar 2 mile circle. Go ahead and click forward twice. There we go. So then they had to go farther out. This is a 5 mile circle, and down the lower left-hand corner is a little town called Kershaw. And according to news reports, it's a very depressed small town off in the corner, and we do wish them the best. Click forward. But if you notice, in most of that 5 mile circle, there is nowhere near the same type of population density that you would see in Idaho, Maryland. So what's fascinating and helpful in this RDN report, on the right-hand side is a screenshot where they show a purple circle with properties within 3 miles of the mine sites, and you can see that Kershaw is down there in the lower left-hand corner. What you'll notice is there's hardly any properties near the mine and you have to go 3 miles away to get close to them. Next slide. So what happened in this hail mine when the analysis was made for this economic report? Here's what they saw. And they went 10 miles away and analyzed properties that far away. So within 10 miles of this mine, there's a slight bump from just under 100,000 to just over 100,000. That is current sales. That's $100,000, you'll notice, is from 2016 to 2022. So if you look at that purple circle, you'll look at that valuation, I think it's pretty clear that while they worked hard to find a comparable mine operation, they don't find comparable properties in proximity, and it certainly isn't the same value. Average median home sale value right now in Nevada County is around $500,000. So if you're analyzing a proposed project mine against property values, these aren't the same properties, these aren't the same values. It's basically around $100,000 either way. Next slide, please. So then the second case study that they looked at was a project that is in Tennessee. And what I want you to notice is the two dates at the very bottom of this paragraph. See where it says 2007, 2009. One of the other things that these are great case studies for is showing how these mines change owners often. For example, this mine had an owner until 2001. They closed it for 6 years. Another owner in 2007. 2 years later, another owner in 2009. So oftentimes these are just temporary plays to get a foot in the door and perhaps just flip the permit to another company willing to take it on, a revolving door of mine operators. Next slide. But let's look at the population density from satellite to really see, are these really good case studies for our properties and our values? The interesting thing about the Coy mine in Tennessee is, indeed, this was the one that actually had the largest population the closest to the mine. There's a town to the left of it, Jefferson City. Now, if you look at most of the concentric circles here, which is half mile, mile, and 2 miles, you can see that in that 2 mile radius, there really isn't much on the right-hand side of that circle, but there is Jefferson City. So this was, out of the three, the closest approximation of having a large amount of people very close to the mine. Next slide. And if we back out and take a look at the larger picture using a 5 mile radius, and again, it's important to note that for all three of these case studies, when they looked at home sales, they went out to a 10 mile distance. So here's the 5 mile ring around the Coy mine, and you can see a large part of it is undeveloped, and there's certainly a big water feature there. Next slide. So let's see, according to the report's authors, where all of the black dots lie for properties located within that. Oh yeah, and then here's the 5 mile look for us. If you go out 5 miles from Grass Valley, now you've got Nevada City, you're out to Bitney, you've got Chicago Park involved, you even have bits of Alta Sierra. There's a lot of development. If you look around within that 5 mile ring, you can see that there are roads leading to properties most everywhere. This is thousands and thousands of homes and properties here within that 5 mile circle. Next slide. So how does that compare to the Coy mine, which had the largest city the closest to the mine itself? Here's the screenshot from the report on the right. They drew a 5 mile radius around the Coy mine. You can see how it matches our 5 mile radius on the left, and you can see the sprinkling around of properties, and indeed there's a cluster that's right next to the mine in Jefferson City. Next slide. So what happened in this one that actually had the most properties the closest to the mine? What was the impact on their properties? Were they the same as far as value? Because they certainly were similar as far as proximity, but when you're looking at property value, it's important to have comparable properties and comparable value. So within 10 miles of the Coy mine in Tennessee, they actually saw a loss in value, a 12% drop. So you can see that when there is something close to the mine, properties that are encircling it, there tends to be a loss. But we would also say that this still really isn't that comparable because the property values are a fraction of what we're seeing here in our area. Next slide. So let's take a look at the third and final case study, because again, what we tend to see is they did their best to find 3 mines that were similar to this proposed project, but they really struggled to find 3 communities and properties and values that were similar to this proposed project. So here is an underground gold mine outside Sutter Creek, California. Seems to be most similar as far as operation and mineral and process, and the closest as far as geography to California. But what I want you to take note of is in this picture right here, before we go into the concentric circles, this really gives you a great sense of the topography and how it matters. Right now we're looking southward. The mine is in the front. And then over in the distance is the little town of Sutter Creek. It also is a cute old mining town that has a tourist economy. But what you'll notice is around the mine is mostly just fields and a large hill that shields the noise and the view from the rest of the town. You'll also notice that there is an immediate spur off of Highway 49 that's on the right-hand side, so that the mine can operate with largely no traffic, visual, or noise impacts to Sutter Creek. And that's important to know, because this doesn't represent what our community would feel with our project. Next slide. So remember this picture right here as we go through these satellite shots with concentric circles, and then this is the last of the 3 case studies. But hopefully you're getting a sense of the fact that within the proximity to these mine sites, there really aren't a lot of development. So you've got a half-mile, a mile, and 2-mile red concentric circles. You have Sutter Creek there down at the bottom, because that other picture we were looking at was looking southward, so it was as if we were north of the mine looking south. And then there's a little city called Amador City off to what would be around 10 o'clock on the clock, or in a northwest direction. But otherwise, look within that 2-mile circle. There's practically minimal development and wildland there, and the closest town, again, is completely protected from traffic, noise, and visual impact. Next slide. And as a reminder, again, these are 2-mile red circles right there, the largest one, and the report continued to look at 10 miles away, analyzing all the property values, because sometimes that's how far away they had to go in order to collect enough properties similar to ours. So this is a 10-mile circle around the Lincoln mine that's in Sutter Creek. And you can see 10 miles around, there still isn't much around. Next slide. So while it is a comparable mine, it doesn't appear to be a comparable situation with properties. So here is their report with a 2-mile purple circle. You can see Sutter Creek properties, but look at that purple circle. It's mostly completely empty. And again, Sutter Creek is set aside from the impacts that we would feel, which would be visual impacts, traffic, noise. Next slide, please. So were they comparable, at least in value, and what happened at this underground mine? Well, they went 10 miles away, and what they proposed is that you might see a 17 or 18% jump in your property value. This was something that the report alluded to, saying, well, hey, look at Sutter Creek. If you're 10 miles away from this mine that no one can practically see or hear anyway, it seems like prices are okay if you get closer and closer to the mine. So this is also still a fraction of our values. So again, it's not quite similar property density and location. It's not quite our values. These are the 3 best that they could do. This means, again, that this is really an unprecedented project. Next slide. If you want to have a sense of the fact that their property values were expected to increase, we noticed that in California during that time period of the last slide around the Lincoln mine, California property values doubled. So if those properties only went up 18%, they actually were at a loss of under market value. So right here is what people are familiar with. This is the median sales price of houses in the United States over the last couple of decades. The gray bars are a couple of recessions. Next slide. And let's see how the before and after time periods for these 3 case studies aligned. The 3 before periods were generally when prices were flatter. The after values were when it was steeper. They didn't account for that fact and demonstrate what the expected property value increase would be due to the market. So we would submit that the Lincoln mine actually showed quite a loss below what its property value climb should have been. Next slide. And then lastly, to really underscore the unprecedented nature of our project in this proposal, along the bottom you can see the dates. It runs left to right, 1983 to the present year. There's a vertical dotted line right in the middle. That's just delineating the 1900s from the 2000s. And at the top, you look at the Haley mine in South Carolina. Based on the RDN report, it was periodically mined and considered active until December 2002, closed for 8 years before it was reopened, had its ramp-up period, and then hit full operations. So their before values that they claimed the property values before a mine was open were during that time period. We would say that that's really not a good capture of before a mine's open, because the mine was just opened a few years ago. The same is true for the Coy mine in Tennessee. According to RDN, it operated until 2001, was closed for 5 years, and opened right back up. Down in Lincoln, they mentioned RDN report, it was abandoned in 1999, closed for 13 years, reopened. So we would say that if these are the three best case studies, they actually show communities that have pretty much always had mines opened with a very brief period of closure. The difference here is in our community, our mine has been closed for a very long time. And so our development and our properties have encroached closely upon it, as these other communities likely would if they had mines closed for 70 years. We believe that's why they actually couldn't find properties close to these other three mines, because the mines have pretty much always been open, so why build next to it? Again, the unprecedented nature of our project. Next slide. So we don't feel it was a great case study for property values, but when we looked at these projects, they were great case studies for other things on how long it takes to get to full operation. There are three arrows here pointing out the three different phases considered with a project like this. There's pre-operation, while they're trying to get permits. There's the ramp-up phase. They've gotten permits and they're working to get to full operation, and then ongoing. Take a look at the last sentence in pre-operation phase, the first red arrow. At the end of that paragraph, it says, during this period, the general public learns about the upcoming project. Public perceptions can begin impacting property values already. Next slide. Now look at the three mines down below and how long it took to get from pre-operation to ramp up. But once they get their permits, from ramp up to ongoing, it took 6 years for the Haley gold mine, 2014 to 2020, 7 years for the Coy mine, 2006 to 2013, another 6 years for the Lincoln mine. So these case studies show in real life the three best, closest mines that they could find. There's a 6 to 7 year time lag from when they get the permit and ramp up to hitting full capacity. The screenshot you see right in the middle of this slide, though, this is from the RDN report. They just took whatever Rise Gold told them to be true, and Rise Gold thinks that they will be able to cut that into less than half. 18 months to get started, another 18 months for ramping up, 3 years, and boom, we've got full production. Next slide. Well, why is that important? So 3 years instead of 6 or 7 years, what's the big deal? Well, here's the big deal. When it comes to the impacts to our county general fund, this is a table that has the years across the top. And then you have a column of numbers under each year. You've got the cost to the community, to the county general fund. You've got the revenues, and then at the very bottom you have the net result. What's really important is what this shows is until this mine is actually in full operation, it's a negative net drain on our general fund. So if they say it's going to be 3 years and they have minimal experience, these three case studies of real life show it's likely going to be more like 6 or 7 years. That means an additional negative digging of a net hole for the community in our general fund, which means it's that much harder for them to climb out of it. Next slide. So these were great case studies for showing a few things. Maybe not home property value impact, because they weren't close to our values and they weren't close to our properties. But they were really similar mines, and it shows timelines likely take twice as long, costing our general fund a lot of money. We also discovered in looking at reports in news media that all three of these best case studies, similar to our project, incurred fines and failures to comply with environmental rules and regulations, sometimes totaling millions of dollars, for things like water quality, hazardous waste, and, unfortunately, a fatality due to poor equipment maintenance at one of the three. These are also case studies showing how frequent the ownership changes, likely making this just a temporary, hopeful investment before flipping it and selling it to the next mine operator. And these were case studies that show, even if there was any sort of climb in property value, it was far below what the market average was. Next slide. So let's recap what we've talked about. What this report showed is the economic ripple effect on both local spending and local jobs is less than half of what Rise Gold says. And according to the other presenters here, likely even less than that. So Rise Gold got it wrong on the ripple effects of spending, the ripple effects of jobs, and the proposed timeline is likely going to be twice as long. If Rise Gold can't get these things right on paper, why should anyone trust them to do better in real life? What the report shows, and the limited scope of its material, shows that the economic benefits are likely lower and the costs likely higher. A few might share in the benefits if this proposal went through, but we would all share the losses. Next slide. That would be loss of tourism, loss of property value, loss of desirability. We show that most input for the revenue and expenses came directly from Rise Gold, someone who has no experience successfully running a mine. They've tried one other time to open a mine, and it was not successful. And so the facts of the proposal are questionable, but again, it wasn't within the scope of the authors to question Rise Gold. They assumed everything Rise Gold says is true, and they based their assumptions on making even more gold discoveries than what proven reserves have shown. Now, again, we've said the conclusions are only good as the data used, and all of the data came from Rise Gold. Next slide. There was also several costs that they didn't collect. There are dozens of long-term adverse environmental impacts in the DEIR: traffic, noise, vibration, visual. And in the report, the authors said, RDN themselves, that these types of long-term adverse impacts would make the surrounding area a less desirable place to visit. So there would be economic costs. And in the surveys of local businesses and real estate agent professionals, they all agreed. But RDN didn't try to quantify the economic cost to real estate. Actually, that should say the economic cost to tourism. If we lost just 5 to 10% of our tourism, if we were able to keep 90 to 95% of our tourism levels after this mine opened, which is just a theoretical maybe, we would still lose $20 to $40 million a year, meaning we would lose 200 to 400 jobs. That alone would offset and wipe out any purported gains from this mine proposal. Next slide. And that's only if we lost 5 to 10%. Let's try and quantify the loss of property values that the authors did. They said there would be no impact on property values because when they looked at the 3 case studies, they were inconclusive. When they looked at the literature, it was irrelevant. When they talked to local experts, they didn't know what they were talking about. But again, there was no comparable academic studies. And the survey of real estate agents projected a loss. So while RDN didn't try to quantify the impact on property values, we can just run a back of the envelope. There are 2,000 homes located within a half mile of the mineral rights, not a half mile of the mine, a half mile of the mineral rights, which spread underground much farther than the mine. If those 2,000 homes within a half mile of the mineral rights just lose 10% of our average median home sale price of $500,000, that's $100 million in total property value loss. Now, homes might sell an average of every 15 years, so if we divide that by 15, it would average out to almost $7 million a year on top of the $20 to $40 million losses in tourism. Suddenly we're approaching almost $50 million a year in lost property value and tourism. Next slide. Which about equals what they're proposing. So this limited scope masked the costs, overstated the benefits, and showed that Rise Gold is not ready. This project is not ready for reality. And if you take accurate costs and benefits and weigh them against each other, at best, this proposal If everything goes according to plan with a rookie operator with a shaky track record, this might be a wash if we're lucky. More than likely, though, it'll be a net loss long-term to the community, at worst, a catastrophe. The applicant's limited experience and their prior mining venture, which they're still under litigation for damages, they tried to open a mine, and within a couple of years it was bankrupt and it was facing fines. In our consensus of reading this report, even with its limited scope, and filling in the gaps, the risk for this project clearly outweighs the reward.